I was here for 26 years, along with my predecessor John Suthill, who was an inspiration and became a good friend. We were two of the three longer-serving abbots in the history of Hyde Abbey. And I'm proud and humbled to have been head of one of the great monastic houses of Europe, at a time when the abbey itself was relatively stable, but when there was also great changes afoot in how England was governed and managed. And as I tell you these stories, the memories just come flooding back. When John Suthill died, I was elected to take his place. I was in the job less than 2 years. It was the month of February, I remember. It was a very cold winter. I was summoned to Westminster by the King, Henry III, to witness an important charter. The King, of his own accord, had agreed to reissue the Great Charter, or MAGNA CARTA as it is known. His father, King John, had been forced by the barons to sign it 10 years earlier. But John denounced it almost immediately, tore it up, and got Pope Innocent to back him. King John was a very unpopular king, and once he died, the noblemen of England, and indeed the merchants and other wealthy people, they wanted change. They wanted to upend the establishment and give rights to ordinary, free men. There were even some rights for women, and who would have believed that in 1225? And I was to witness it, signed by King Henry in the Palace of Westminster. It was a long way from the backwaters of a brewing house in Palliard's Twitchings, outside Kingsgate here in Winchester, where I grew up as a boy. I was very nervous indeed. I felt it should have been John's signature, not mine. How could I possibly fill his shoes? What would they make of me? We left Winchester 3 days before the signing, breaking our journey in Reading and then moving on to Westminster with Simon, the Abbot of Reading. He helped calm my nerves on the ride. Simon wasn't in the best of health. He died the following year, but he was determined to sign the Great Charter himself. As we approached Southwark, it began to sleet. Some of the Reading monks started up singing, "Summer is a-coming in." Simon laughed so much I had to steady his horse to stop him falling. We were guests of Southwark Priory, which was opposite a tanning house. Tanning houses, let me tell you, their smell is indescribable. And sadly, it was 80 years too soon to stay in our own Tabard Inn. The day of the signing was a Tuesday, February the 11th, and Simon said he was well enough to walk the 4 miles to Westminster. We walked by the Thames, which made our Itchen seem very small, escorted by 6 of our older monks who'd never been to London before. I'd only been twice. We thanked God it was nowhere near as cold as it had been the previous day. We reached the palace in good time for the signings. 65 of us were gathered, all the great swell of England, earls, barons, bishops, abbots, ministers, and the king. My signature was 24th in the charter, and the Bishop of Winchester, Peter de Roche, was 4th. I think he was rather annoyed I wasn't further down the list, being as young as I was and relatively newly elected. He was certainly annoyed after supper. We'd broken from table when Archbishop Stephen asked to be introduced to the new Abbot of Hyde. I shook, but I needn't have. Stephen asked me about John. I hadn't realized what good friends they'd been, and they had been for many, many years. He was saddened not to attend his burial. We talked for, it must have been half a candle's wane, about him, about my plans for Hyde Abbey, the consequences of the Magna Carta and how it would change the landscape of England. He shared with me part of a prayer he'd been writing for Pentecost Sunday. He said, "I wanted a prayer to celebrate the birthday of the church, but with a fresh spirit, to complement the new, fairer England I hope this great charter will bring about." "How did you first meet John?" he asked. I said, like John, I came from very humble roots. When my father died, the Abbey allowed my mother to take over the tenancy of the brew house in Winchester, which they owned and where I was brought up. That was very unusual before the charter you've just signed, he said. My father was a skilled ale maker, I told him. His beer was the finest in Hampshire, and he often came to the Abbey to advise the monks on the best way to brew their hops. "That makes great sense," he said. "Fine ale is not unimportant for the well-being of an abbey, and that is something I know too well." I told him my mother wanted a different life for me. And through my father's connection with the Abbey, she managed to find me a job there as a gardener's boy. I loved tending the fruit trees, particularly the cherry and the walnut. John had been abbot for some years, and in the summer months would often pray in the orchard. Servants of the Abbey were forbidden to be there when he prayed, but he allowed me to stay as long as I got on with my work. And it wasn't too long after that he asked me to become a monk. But that is how I first met him. I told him when John lay dying, and it looked likely I would be elected the next abbot of Hyde, I said to him, "Why me? You loved the walnut tree, and you loved the cherry with equal measure. I hated the walnut, but loved the cherry. I watched you closely. I learned from you." Stephen's face, it broke to a smile the like I have never seen on any other. He begged his leave, saying there were many people he needed to speak to, but not before he gave me his blessing, telling me not to fear. He felt confident I would uphold all the good works John had put in place at Hyde Abbey. And he said to me, "Remember the things from your past, good and bad. Do not be afraid of them. Bring them to how you lead your life now. The bad will get less, the good will blossom. The sweet guest of your soul will guide you." And I have never forgotten those words.